Welcome to CyberLaw Now, the podcast where technology meets consumer rights, the law, and cybersecurity, hosted by renowned attorney Steven Teppler. We'll get to the podcast in just a moment. Right now, we'd like to recognize our partners who help make this podcast possible.
Online privacy. Is there really such a thing in today's everything goes and gets posted digital world? Is privacy good or bad? And who's it for? When did we even start being concerned with privacy? What laws protect our privacy or take it away? What about our children? What if I told you that the last federal law protecting people from cyber intrusion was passed in the 1980s before there was even an internet? Or that there is no federal law protecting you from privacy expressly worded in any statute? Or that the only federal child protection law is now 20 years old and hasn't been updated? Or that our computerized election systems are at risk? And what most of the laws passed since the 1980s protect companies and not individuals? Or that companies want to keep you from suing them in court if they're responsible for privacy invasions or other cybercrime? Sounds paranoid, doesn't it? Want to learn more about cyber protection, laws, and how they affect you and the nation? Join me, Steven Teppler, on the CyberLaw Now podcast, where I'll be joined by Ben Tomhave, an independent security analyst, consultant, and cybersecurity and privacy expert.
Malicious software. The results are coming.
They say we are not prepared.
Spine snooping.
It's scary.
Welcome to the CyberLaw Now podcast. I chair the cybersecurity and privacy practice at the Mandelbaum-Salzberg law firm. Here at CyberLaw Now, we discuss today's cybersecurity issues, look at the legal side of these issues, make you aware of them, how they affect you, and what you can do to protect yourself. I am absolutely thrilled today to have as my guest Ben Tomhave, an independent security analyst, consultant, cybersecurity and privacy expert from the Washington, D.C. metro area. Welcome, Ben. And tell us a little bit about what you do and why this area and the area we're going to be talking about today is artificial intelligence is of special interest to you.
Hi, Stephen. Thank you for having me on the show today. Greatly appreciate the invitation. As an independent consultant, former and recovering Gartner analyst at one point, and I've worked a number of different roles within the security space over the last couple decades plus. It's an interesting world. You know, we know that all the data is out there. We've been hearing for at least a decade now about big data, and now, of course, all the rage is AI in all its various incarnations, whether that be actual artificial intelligence or machine learning, deep learning as they may call it, and so on and so forth. The interesting thing that we're finding, aside from the typical overhyping and overselling of what may or may not actually amount to AI today, is that the data that we feed into a lot of these systems ends up being very poor, and that leads to overall very poor AI decision analysis and decision making as an output coming out of these systems. And I think there's a number of examples, and we can certainly go through a bunch of them. A tangible one I can give you too that shows you some of the shortcomings is there are a number of security-specific tools today. They make wide-ranging claims about being AI, and yet at the end of the day, when you dig into it, you find that they actually aren't doing much in the way of training and learning your environment, and they typically require people to go in and create specific rules that just do very basic pattern matching on a manual basis overall, even though there's still masses of data out there that we're trying to cut through and make use of, especially within a security monitoring and incident response framework. So where do you want to start, Stephen? What sounds good to you?
Well, it all sounds great to me. Are you kidding? I've got questions upon questions for you, Ben. So first, let's get down to basics, and I think my listeners are also wanting to know what actually is artificial intelligence, AI, how does it differ from machine learning, and where does big data play a role? So I guess this is a three-part question that I have for you.
I don't have necessarily an easy answer for you overall. The promise of AI, artificial intelligence, I think is well beyond the scope of anything we see today except perhaps in the most advanced research labs. So what I would say is what people have told us is that AI is kind of an overarching construct within which we find sub-disciplines and sub-practices such as machine learning. So let's focus on machine learning, which at its very basic functionality literally is just an algorithm, a learning algorithm, oftentimes employing different types of statistical modeling methods, maybe even Bayesian statistical analysis tools. You feed in data and it looks for patterns and identifies patterns, and either through pre-assigned rules, it can learn what is good and what is bad, or you can explicitly go in and tell it, this data is good, this data is bad. That's fundamentally the basics of ML as it's been for the last almost 20 years now. I first dealt with machine learning and Bayesian analysis through a tool called Spam Assassin, which was an open source tool for protecting email systems from spam, of all things. And of course, Spam Assassin had a problem in that you would train it on a batch of spam in a given month, and then the next month the spammers would change the wording and the style of language within their emails, their spam messages, and then of course nothing would get caught until you retrained it on the new messages every month, and so on and so forth, and hence things took forever to try to ever get anywhere positive, and then by the time you got caught up, everything changed. But yeah, fundamentally we're talking about algorithms that are being fed data, told good and bad, and those algorithms essentially create patterns that can then be used automatically to make those good and bad determinations.
You know, what concerns me as a lawyer, and I'm always coming at this from an evidentiary perspective, which is, how truthful is the information? What's the fact? What are the facts? What are the indisputable inputs that just can't be denied, like a sun rising in the morning in the east and setting in the evening in the west? When people talk about big data, my understanding as a lawyer and a wannabe technologist is to have this large aggregation of disparate data from all different places, which are then kind of cobbled together to in a way that informs us about something. And my understanding about big data is that it has great use in epidemiology, studies over large populations to see trends of diseases, of social maladies, what have you. But my concern has always been you have these algorithms which are sucking up all this big data, but how do we know that data has any kind of verity to it?
Yeah, I think it's a huge problem. And this is the fundamental problem in computer science. We refer to this as GIGO, garbage in, garbage out, where the value of your analytical system, whatever method you're using, is only so good as the data that goes into it. And perhaps the most tangible example many of us can relate to is, you went to a website and you saw something that seemed interesting and you clicked on a link and it took you to the wrong page and you really didn't want to be there. And then 2 days later, you're on your Facebook and suddenly an advertisement pops up for whatever the thing was that you ended up on. You really had no interest in it whatsoever, but at some point the data got collected, the cookies got all passed around, and that little bit of misclicking ends up being part of your profile that they're maintaining about you. And that's all done through some sort of automatic learning. The other one that always gets me is I'm fairly convinced that on my phone, Google is always listening to me, because I'll have a conversation going, or I'll be reading something somewhere, or even watching a show on TV, and I'll say to myself or think to myself, I wonder what X is. And I'll go in and I'll start to type in Google search on my phone, what is, and it just magically pre-populates with whatever the topic was that I was just going to look at, which is kind of creepy because it means it's watching my phone and everything. But the validity of that is really quite challenging, right? If someone, here's a current example from time of recording. It's been announced tonight that Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen has died from complications from non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. I don't know what that is. if I go search on that, does that mean I'm now going to have that associated with my profile somewhere? Is that in the future something that then gets conveyed to my insurance company, my health insurance provider, and then they start looking into my health insurance more in depth and saying, oh, well, maybe he has cancer?
And you know what? There are no laws to stop that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The other one is the Apple Watch, right? That's the big one that just came out. The updated Apple Watch now can detect that you have a heart attack and even be programmed to do automatic things if it detects you have a heart attack. Same story, right? There's, once that data is gone and it's all going out to a cloud service provider somewhere, there's nothing to control it, nothing to protect it, at least within the U.S.
Thanks, Ben. When we return, we'll find out more about artificial intelligence, its use and misuse, with Ben Tomhave, an independent security analyst, consultant, cybersecurity, and privacy expert. Welcome back to the CyberLaw Now podcast. I'm attorney Steven Teppler, and I am really thrilled to have Ben Tomhave, an independent security analyst, consultant, cybersecurity, and privacy expert, here with us on the podcast. We're talking about artificial intelligence, the data that it gathers, how it chunks it up, how it comes back to affect your everyday digital life. And Ben, we were talking about how you might have misclicked onto a website about something you have absolutely no interest in. And for days and days and days, you'll see pop-up ads coming out and asking you if you have an interest in purchasing any one of a number of different different vendors offering for all this sort of stuff, all this information that you don't need. My question is, if you know, Facebook does this. Facebook is one of the great vacuum cleaners of information in modern times. How long will that misclick stay in your Facebook profile, do you think, or do you know?
Well, that's a good question. I would imagine a single misclick should not actually stick with your profile for very long, right? A single data point is pretty anomalous overall. The issue comes when you start building on that profile and actually start establishing a pattern of interest over time. And it's especially with sites like Facebook and even Google that use cookies across multiple sites to collect data very promiscuously, we shall say. It's very easy for them to gather a lot of that data. And by the way, it's not just through browsing information either, right? They also have very good AI that can do processing of video and pictures in particular. And so if you go and you travel and you take a trip somewhere, and not only are you maybe looking into the trip ahead of time, but then you're checking in possibly at restaurants or entertainment venues during your trip, posting pictures during or after your trip. All of that's being processed, and all of that is information that goes towards your profile. And in the case of pictures, a lot of times they now have GPS stamps in there to take away a lot of the guesswork overall. And it's not unusual. We have seen in the past where pictures will suddenly find their way into other uses outside of what your intended use case originally was. Facebook, I know, has made some changes with their security and privacy settings and commitment to reduce that from happening, but it still does happen on occasion in their site and other sites as well, where pictures will suddenly pop up overall. So I think it's a discouraging trend overall, and the fact that for the most part we really have no rights to claw back any of that information, any of that data over time, also poses some interesting concerns. And something that's been talked about numerous times, and as the parent of two, I certainly have this concern. Any teenage youthful indiscretions that get posted online, what's the recourse for pulling that back and washing that off the internet? Will it ever go away? We've heard stories of that sort of thing negatively impacting admissions to universities. We've even heard, talking about use of AI, automated systems to go out and spider for information. I've saw a story within the last couple of weeks that a young person had their offer letter rescinded from a major university because they made a comment, whether seriously or in jest, being critical of the university, and it led to the university withdrawing the acceptance letter. So there's some very real impacts for people overall. And I think it only gets worse, especially the longer we go without any sort of controls and any sort of assignment of rights to individuals to, lay claim over that data and have the ability to claw it back, or at least seal it until you want to disclose it.
So one of my big concerns, I shouldn't say a favorite concern, but it's in my target area, is the use of your DNA profile and how your physical DNA profile will eventually get matched up with your digital DNA profile. And what we're doing is we're creating our digital doppelgangers. We're creating our digital twins out in the ether right now. And the more we do, the more unique the more unique that glob of information that we feed into this great gaping maw of social media and search engines becomes. And that opens up a huge potential for abuse and misuse, which can follow you around for the rest of your life. And really, aside from freezing your credit and perhaps if there's a data breach, getting a couple of years of fairly useless data monitoring, which just says that something is happening, it's always reactive, not preventive. What else is there?
Yeah, I think there's a huge potential risk here. And I'll tell you, the one that I think is most concerning actually relates back to health data and health insurance. For example, we know that for athletes who get struck in the head on a regular basis, whether that's through having a soccer ball being headed or through football tackles and hits and things like that, or through hockey getting checked or whatever, even wrestlers getting slammed to the mat, we know that now seems to have a degree of compounding impact over time. And even for college athletes especially, and then on into professional athletes, there's a very real chance of serious negative impacts of CTE, such as the NFL great Junior Seau suffered from. So what's to stop collecting all of this data, because all of it's being posted willingly online, of your kids are, say you have a son and he goes out and he plays in the kids passing league early on and then goes on and plays junior high and high school football. What's to stop an insurance company from factoring that into insurance rates over time and using that to escalate the overall rates and potentially, depending on the legislation around pre-existing conditions, potentially also banning or at least putting a severe premium on those rates due to the potentiality for CTE or other types of neurological disorders as one gets older, brought on through AI doing predictive modeling of what it looks like, what happens using this, of the data of your health data over time and in your activity data and things like that. It's somewhat of perhaps a long-winded, example, but nonetheless, right? I think the risk is very real, and the ability of AI systems, at least to do a lot of rapid modeling and do some of that projected analysis, poses a pretty severe risk, that anything you do today could come back to haunt you in 20 years, at least when it comes to how companies treat you and how they charge you and things like that.
So things are getting worse rather than getting better, which is really, it's concerning. It's concerning to us as lawyers because we look at people's, data and what they produce and what they have, and we say, who owns your data? And I'm of the position that you own your data. What people do with it, how they sell it, how they resell it, is all something that becomes more and more murky as time goes on. And when we return, we'll find out more about artificial intelligence, the use of your data, privacy with Ben Tomhave, an independent security analyst, consultant, cybersecurity, and privacy expert. Welcome back to the CyberLaw Now podcast. I'm attorney Steven Teppler, and I'm really thrilled to have with me today Ben Tomhave, an independent security analyst, consultant, cybersecurity, and privacy expert here on the podcast. We're talking about artificial intelligence and its effect on our daily life. So, Ben, let's talk a little bit more about artificial intelligence and talk about AI in cars, and because that's where it's really being touted. All of these cars that now are supposed to be self-parking or self-driving or partially self-driving, they're all driven, so to speak, by software. And software is not perfect, at least in my understanding. How do we reconcile sticking all this software in vehicles and saying, well, but they'll be safe, don't worry about it. This AI accounts for every possible permutation of traffic and pedestrian and animal life that you can think of?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. We certainly have seen real data where those systems have failed, whether that's a Tesla on autopilot that doesn't see a truck because the radar cross-section was inadequate and it went right underneath it and almost took somebody's head off, or I believe it was a Uber auto-driving car in the Phoenix area, right, that rammed into a bunch of pedestrians, and that continues to be a bunch of, there continue to be a lot of problems with that overall. I think the appeal of AI with self-driving cars is we can fairly reasonably define what the rules are around appropriate driving. What we can't do a very good job of is defining all of the potential environments in which the vehicle will find itself and then how it will apply those rules within those environments. Now, certainly with AI and big data, we can apply a certain degree of modeling and introduce a lot of those different scenarios and hopefully see how it would act in that type of scenario. And I would suspect that's probably where a lot of research is focused right now, is how do you take a vehicle into a simulated environment and then train it really well to make it very smart. If I were doing the research, that's certainly how I would be approaching it. But that doesn't account for everything. And you never know, combinatorics can only go so far, listen, I almost had fresh grilled venison on the front of my vehicle last night coming home from shopping after work. Not exactly the night that I was hoping, and I was glad that I was paying attention and not looking at my phone and saw the little 2-point buck as it decided to trot out across the very dark street, hit the brakes, hit the horn, and it scampered off. I would imagine a self-driving car would see that and do the same. But what do you do if there's, a deer on one side and pedestrians on the other, or oncoming traffic and conditions are slippery, or so on and so forth, right? So I think there's a lot of potential things that can go wrong. On the other hand, I don't know that fear-mongering is necessarily where we want to go with a lot of this either. I think we have to figure out how to set a reasonable standard for safety that can then be met by these systems, and then ensure that we're evolving that standard. And if that, that may amount to having a UL-like environment that does certifications on these cars. Who knows? I would say the easier one will be election security overall. But it seems like self-driving cars are the ones that are going to get there first.
You bring up an interesting point, Ben, and that is, what if you're faced, I guess this is, and maybe this is the wrong analogy to make, the prisoner's dilemma. If you're stuck between a rock and a hard place, if you're a UAV and you have a choice between hitting a school bus and hitting pedestrians, how do you make that determination to do one thing or the other? And so far, in my experience, nobody's told me about how AI can pick the lesser of two evils, or that it can recognize, two catastrophes in the making and pick out which one of the two must happen.
Yeah, I don't think there's a good answer for that to get today. And, part of this also comes down to, I don't know that everybody would have a universally correct answer. Certainly we can go to the ethical philosophers and ask them to provide the quote-unquote right answer. But, context matters, right? And if you're driving a fairly lightweight sedan, and you're about to run into the back of a school bus versus swerving and hitting pedestrians, hitting the school bus probably makes the most sense because the bus is far more likely to survive damage. Now, is that going to be accounted for in the calculations and in the simulations? I don't know. I would assume so. Some people might argue some more off of inflammatory reaction and emotional reaction rather than thinking about it. But some might argue, oh, hitting the bus is the worst option. And maybe it is, right? If you're a panel truck, hitting the bus probably is the wrong option if it's full of kids. Now, if it's just got a driver and there's nobody on there, hit the bus, right?
If the AI knows that that's the case. All right.
Exactly.
But there's the harder cases. What about children crossing the street versus adult pedestrians on the side of the road? And we don't really have an answer for that yet. And I haven't heard one. And
I haven't either.
And I don't think the question's really been asked. And I think we should.
Oh, I think it's been asked. I've certainly seen it's raised in various articles that discuss AI and self-driving cars. I think researchers are well aware of these types of ethical questions in particular. And I think this is why we aren't seeing self-driving cars prominently on the road. It's not a lack of driving technology at this point. It's a lack of safety technology. And, until these things can be sorted out, I don't think we can necessarily trust cars on the roads in that capacity. Now, that said, there are probably, and there probably will continue to be evolving specialty use cases where full automation certainly makes sense, right? And we've already seen this. Most shipyards, most modern shipyards are heavily automated today, even including trucks to ferry cartons around the shipyard itself, moving things around. And it's not a very far step to say, okay, specific designated truck routes will look somewhat like we perhaps saw in the Logan movie a year or two ago, where the trucks go flying down the road, and when you get on, you're essentially waiving any right to sue people unless something truly went wrong, knowing that there's a significant risk of these automated vehicles out there. I could absolutely see infrastructure being upgraded as such. We have hot lanes today, high occupancy toll lanes, that are designated for certain types of traffic. Why not having certain lanes and certain highways designated for self-driving long-haul trucks as well?
There certainly is promise to AI. I think in the end, and what I would like to see, but I have not yet, again, is an explanation made perhaps of how you can imbue AI with a sense of ethics. And I'm not sure that's programmable. I'm not sure that's learnable as machine learning, but we can talk about that another time. So we've been to artificial intelligence school and big data school and machine learning school today with Ben Tomhave, an independent security analyst, consultant, cybersecurity expert, privacy expert. We've learned about how this information is being gathered, how machines are really trying to learn what humans have known all along about, knowing where to drive, how to keep safe perhaps. Again, I want to thank you, Ben, for joining us today. And I hope to have you back on CyberLaw Now soon.
Thank you, Steven.
And I want to thank you, our listeners, for your interest. Don't forget to hit subscribe and get all of your podcasts while you sleep. Share them with your friends. If you have a CyberLaw subject you want to hear more about, contact us. Until next time, this is Steven Teppler on the CyberLaw Now podcast.